What's up guys, Jay right here. Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be episode 3 of the C10 Build Series, where we're going to tackle assembling that brand new GM Goodwrench crate engine. Show you what we got going. So we've got our engine here. In the last video, so we just kind of unpacked it just a little bit, gave you a brief look at what you get out of the crate from a GM Goodwrench engine, and we've got all of our parts here that we're going to be focusing on this episode. All right, just to go over a little list of things that we got here. Start off, we got the Edelbrock Performer EPS intake manifold. That's part number 2701. That's for use with a square bore carburetor. That shows actually quite a bit of bolt-on power improvement just from your regular Edelbrock Performer manifold. So if you're using a square bore carburetor and not reusing the factory Quadrajet spread bore, this is definitely the intake to go with. Along with that, we got brand new intake manifold gaskets, some intake bolts from Edelbrock, part number there for you, miscellaneous pipe plug kit, couple of aluminum hoses from Edelbrock. One for vacuum, one for heater hose. We've got some RTV, a new fuel pump, and I'm reusing my old fuel pump push rod because there's nothing wrong with it. We've got our harmonic balancer that we installed that we painted last episode, along with our harmonic balancer install kit from O'Reilly's. Got some brake-in engine oil from Lucas. That is the absolute best brake-in oil you can use. We have an oil pump priming tool. We'll get to that later on. The first thing we're going to tackle for the assembly is going to be the intake manifold. So let me get to it, show you. All right, when you unwrap your Goodwrench crate engine, it's going to come completely painted, nice gloss black. It's going to come with this piece of cardboard over top of the valley cover. So go ahead. Generally, there's going to be a little bit of debris on there. Kind of dust that off a little bit. You don't want that falling into your valley cover. Take that off gently. Okay, and you'll see that we've got inside here, we've got a few parts. So what this comes with inside the valley cover is it comes with new timing pointers. It comes with timing pointers for both a 6-inch and an 8-inch balancer. So make sure you set these aside. I am using an 8-inch balancer for my application. Most C10 truck engines have the 8-inch balancer, so we're going to be using that one, but let's set that aside for now. Okay, so we see that got a bare valley pan here. So let's get to installing the intake manifold. All right, open the box here. And this is what you're gonna see when you get a brand new intake from Edelbrock. So very nice casting material. See, it's got the square bore flange. Doesn't come with any plugs, accessories, anything like that. So that is why you see that I've got the kit here, the additional things that you're gonna need. But this is what you're gonna see when you open the box. So let's go ahead and grab it out. Sit it on top here. The intake manifold gaskets that I've chosen to run here are Felpro part number 1205. They are the newer design Printo seal gaskets. It's a really good gasket. Only one thing to note here, I'll show you a little bit later whenever we pop them open, but it comes with the actual gaskets for where it seats to the head, and then it comes with these cork pieces that are supposed to go on this back side and the front side of the intake manifold. I would highly advise against you not using those pieces of cork, and they're just proven to leak. GM actually, in the later years of the small blocks, switched from using the cork gaskets to just using sealant. That's why we have this ultra gray here. I have the ultra black and the ultra gray. I'll show you different uses for them, but I'm actually going to use the ultra gray here in place of those cork gaskets. The ultra gray just kind of holds up a little bit better to intake manifold torque and whatnot, so that's why we're going to be using that. Once you have both your intake and your gaskets, first thing you're going to want to do is to test fit the intake manifold dry, just to make sure that all of your bolt holes are going to line up. Make sure that everything's kosher with the engine that you have. And main thing is also we're going to be checking the gap between the intake manifold and the block, so that we know how much gasket sealer to put on the ends. So I'm gonna set you guys up on the tripod here and do a little dry fit. All right, so I have the intake manifold dry fitted for the first time. This is a prime example of why you want to fit this before you go ahead and try to seal it up. Because if you look, bolt holes seem like they're lining up perfect, but when you look at the gap on the front, you can see it's a little bit wider on this end than on that end. So I was looking at it, kind of some further inspection, trying to find out what is going on. And if you see, the runners of the intake manifold here and here are actually contacting the valve cover. So that is what's not allowing it to seat fully on this side head. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna kind of clearance this valve cover just a smidge and see if that doesn't fix our problem. All right, so I just took a hammer and a flat blade screwdriver, an old one, and kind of clearanced around the runners on both sides for the valve cover. And as you see, we've got really good alignment for our bolt holes. Sitting flush on that side head, sitting flush on that side head, and we've got almost no gap from the intake manifold to the block. So really good fitment. This right here is why you don't want to use the cork seals to come with your intake gaskets. So if I were to use the cork seal and try to torque this down, that cork seal is just going to pop right out, cause a oil leak right away, and you're going to be ripping that intake off and resealing it. So whenever you're installing the intake manifold, take a mental note here of what your space is between your intake manifold and your block, and try to run that thickness of a bead for your sealant, for your RTV, and that should get you sealed up. You want to be cautious not to put too much on there. Too much, all that's going to do is it's going to squeeze out both sides, and potentially you could have the inside amount that's squeezed out break free at some point in time in the life of the engine and go through your oiling system, plug something up, and you could have catastrophic failure. So please, please, please do not put too much sealant on the ends of the intake manifold here. But next step is we're going to install the intake manifold gaskets. When you open the Felpro 1205 intake gaskets, you're going to see you've got both side intake gaskets. You've also got this little pack. This little pack comes with those cork gaskets that I was telling you about. Throw those away immediately. They cause nothing but problems. But one thing you do want to save in here, this is a new distributor gasket. Make sure you do save that. You're going to need that one. So why I like these 1205 Felpro gaskets so much is they have the Printo seal design. So if you see this blue ring around each port, it's actually almost somewhat of an O-ring seal. So it does really well at sealing up, much better than the old generation. It's kind of a mixture between the old Gen 1 small block and the LS series. If you guys are familiar with LS series, how everything's O-ringed. So I really like using these gaskets. There's a couple of extra things that I like to do before installing them, or while installing them, and I'm going to show you guys that now. Okay, so we're looking at the passenger side head right there, and if you see, you got all four of your intake ports there, and you've got these ports here, and those are your water ports. It is very important that you put a bead of silicone around those, even with the gaskets, just to make sure that they do not leak. If you don't put some silicone around there, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have some coolant leaking. Could go into your intake or into your valley pan, into the engine. No good. Could come out the sides of the intake. So you just want to avoid that by putting a bead of silicone around this, and I'm going to show you how in just a second. But I like to take it a little bit of a step further, and I also like to run just a little bit of a bead around each port itself to help the gasket seal. Those Printo seal gaskets are really good at sealing up, but a little bit of extra silicone, and I'm talking just a dab will do you here. Just helps ensure that you don't have any problems, because the last thing that you want to do after installing your brand new intake manifold and getting in the truck, get your first fire up and find out that you have a leak somewhere. So just to keep that from happening, we're going to go ahead and throw a little bit of light bead on there and make sure that we don't get any leaks. Alright, so we're going to apply our silicone now. Like I said, we're going to do a very light coating of this. I'm doing this with the camera, so it's going to might look a little bit awkward. Just bear with me here. So I'm just going to put just a smidge around those water ports, and I'm just going to take it with my finger just kind of run it around there. Now, you don't need too much here. You just need enough to get you a good seal. All right, something like that. So it looks pretty good. I'm gonna go through and repeat that process on all the water ports and all the intake ports, and then I'm going to mock the gasket up, let the silicone tack up a little bit, so that when I install the manifold itself, the act of dropping the manifold down does not move the gasket and causes some problems. So gonna turn you guys off here, let me finish siliconing the rest of these ports, and I'll be back. All right, as you can see, I've got just a very light skim coat around all the ports here. I'm now gonna install my intake manifold gasket, get it set in place to where all the bolt holes line up, and then I'm gonna let it tack up for maybe 30 minutes to an hour before I install the intake manifold. That way that whenever I slide it down, it does not move. The gasket is on. I've made sure to press on it pretty firmly, just to make sure that the silicone and the gasket have kind of meshed well, and I'm gonna let it sit for about, like I said, 30 minutes to an hour, let it tack up before we drop the intake manifold on. Got the other side all siliconed up with a light coating, and I saw something else that jumped out at me that I wanted to make sure that I told you guys, so that you don't have any problems in advance. So if you'll notice, these center intake bolt holes, if you look, I don't know if you can see my finger up through there, they go directly into the valley pan. So the back side of them is just going straight into the valley pan. So it is imperative, especially on these inside 4 intake manifold bolts, that you put a little bit of either RTV sealant or some thread sealant or something on those bolts when you run them in, or else not, you're going to get an oil leak coming out of those bolts. It's not so imperative on the outside corners, but just a good practice. Go ahead and throw a little bit of RTV on all of the intake bolts before you throw them in. All right, so I have let my intake manifold gaskets tack up. Also ran a bead along the front and the back edge of the block to intake manifold sealing surface. Now, it is very important that whenever you run this bead, that you continue it up into the intake manifold gasket itself, because if you don't have a seal going from the block all the way up into the gasket, it's going to be able to leak out in the corners. Might just start out as a little seep, a little bit of a weep, but it's going to get worse over time, and you're going to have to pull the intake off and do it again. So just make sure whenever you run your bead on the front and the back, whenever you don't use the cork gaskets, because cork gaskets are the devil, go ahead and run that bead of silicone all the way up in there. You won't have any problems. So I'm going to throw the intake manifold on, and I'll pick back up with you guys there. I have gently set the intake manifold in place. I've got both corner bolt holes lined up, and what you want to look for is you want to look for a little bit of squish out of your gasket material on the block surface. So I've got a little bit of that. I'm going to run some bolt holes, some intake manifold bolts in the front and the back corner, just to make sure that everything is seated and square, and we'll get to torquing this thing down. And if you can get all 4 corners of the intake bolts in, gaskets lined up, nothing dropped down, if you've got good squish coming out between the block and the intake manifold, everything's good to go. You're now good to start putting the rest of the bolts in and torquing them to sequence. Now remember, as I told you earlier, these 4 middle intake bolts go straight into the valley pan, so you're going to need to run a little bit of sealer on the threads before you throw them in. So what I'm going to do when I do that is I'm going to throw a little bit of this ultra black on the threads. Doesn't take a lot, just a little bit. Run them down, and then we're going to go through the torque sequence. The final torque on the intake manifold bolts is 11 foot-pounds, so we're probably going to do that in a couple sequences. Probably just run them all down, basically kind of like hand tight with no torque on them, and then we'll kind of go back through and torque them to that 11 foot-pounds. So just as a reference, that is about all that you need for a little bit of RTV on the ends of the threads to seal those bolts up. All right, guys, the camera died and I lost a little bit of footage here, so let me catch you back up where we're at. So I've got the intake manifold, all the bolts run in, RTV on the center 4 on both sides. Got it torqued down. torqued it down to 11 foot-pounds. I do not have a foot-pounds torque wrench that goes down low enough for that. So what I did is I pulled out my inch-pounds torque wrench and did it that way. If you're going to use your inch-pounds torque wrench, which is probably going to be the majority of everybody, go ahead and make sure you remember to multiply that 11 by 12 to get inch-pounds. So that's going to be 132 inch-pounds of torque to put on those. Whenever you're tightening these bolts, make sure you do it in a sequence, in a crosshatch sequence. So you know, start over here, go to the other side, crisscross back and forth all the way through the intake manifold until you got it done. Also off camera that you guys didn't get to see, I went ahead and installed my thermostat housing and thermostat. Pretty basic, straightforward there. Just has a gasket with 2 bolts. Run those down. Make sure not to over tighten. You're going into aluminum. I wouldn't worry too much about torque specs. Just get her nice and tight. Don't put the He-Man on it though. Also installed my plugs in here in the intake manifold, and my 90-degree elbow here for my heater hose fitting. And I also installed my factory one for vacuum line back here. I still got to finish putting some pipe sealant on that and tighten it back up, but that's going to be good to go as far as the intake's concerned right now. Also, went ahead and threw the water pump on. Nothing too crazy there. It just takes the 4 water pump bolts, and I've got a gasket on each side. Not a bad idea to throw a little skim coat of RTV on that as well. So I went ahead and did that just to make sure you don't have any leaks. I also installed the flex plate onto the engine. The 6 bolts get 65 foot-pounds of torque. Make sure you're real accurate in that. It also wouldn't hurt to throw a little bit of Loctite on there as well. And last thing that I got done, you guys didn't get to see on camera, was I installed the fuel pump. So the fuel pump is held in place by these 2 bolts, but it also has a fuel pump plate adapter that it bolts on as well. So I would highly recommend, even if you have a gasket for this, throwing a little bit of black RTV over the seat mating surface from the block to this adapter plate here. Make sure you tighten her down. And whenever you install your fuel pump push rod, a little trick here, make sure you grease a new fuel pump push rod up, even an old one that's going into a new engine for a startup. Put some assembly lube on both ends of it, as well as the arm of the fuel pump itself, just because not much oil gets down to this area of the block during startup. So just to keep things from starting up dry and wearing prematurely, go ahead and throw a bunch of assembly lube on that. But a little trick to help keep the fuel pump push rod up. I know probably more than one of you guys have tried to replace a fuel pump and had that push rod just fall down on you, and you're like, damn, what am I supposed to do now? So GM actually helped us out here. They gave us this bolt hole right here, and if you install the fuel pump push rod and its bore, push it all the way up and find you a longer bolt to thread all the way into this. Snug it down. Don't give her the gorilla torque. Now, you don't want to damage your push rod, but snug her down. And that is actually going to hold the push rod itself in place while you're able to install the fuel pump, and make sure that the arm and the push rod made up nicely, so that you don't have any problems there. So it's a little trick, word to the wise. Helps a whole lot whenever you put one of these together, so I'd recommend it. With that being said, I think we're going to leave her off there for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe. Tune in for part 4, where we finish buttoning up the rest of the engine, getting it ready to throw in the truck. As always, I'm J-Ray. See you guys.